Hello and welcome to the Week 1 video review for Understanding Language. I'm Jo Dixon and I'm delighted to be one of your mentors for the duration of the course. So for this video review, I'll mention a few of the conversations that we've had this week and try to answer a few of your questions. I can't cover everything here, obviously, but Joshua and I are trying our best to respond to some of your comments on all of the steps. And of course, there is a huge amount of expertise amongst all of you participants. So you don't always need a response from us. Most of the discussions this week, of course, are in Week 1 about the topics of the Week 1 materials. But you can, of course, work at your own pace, and some of you will probably start to get ahead and finish earlier than others. Before you go too far, I'd just like to remind you that you do need to upgrade if you want to get a certificate of participation. And upgrading also gives you unlimited access to the course materials after the end of the course. Right, so this week, what have we been talking about? We've had a lot of lovely introductions from all of you. It's great to know a little bit about you and where you are in the world. We've tried to introduce a few theoretical ideas about language without getting too heavy, hopefully. We've talked about what it means to know a language. We've talked about meaning, different types of meaning. We've looked a little bit at what is easy and what is difficult in learning a language and what factors impact on language learning, and there are some good discussions about learning styles, which is always controversial and good to discuss. On step 1.12, Simon disagrees with the idea of no pain, no gain, an expression used in the video on step 1.12. And it appears from the responses to him that we're actually quite divided in terms of our opinions on this, in terms of whether we think learning should always be fun, or whether actually we need a challenge and we need to learn to cope with that and to push through the pain. An interesting discussion. If you haven't seen it yet, pop back to step 1.12, have a look and let us know what you think. On step 1.14, Victoria has started a discussion that has attracted a lot of likes and replies, and that's about the relationship between effective teaching and motivation, prompted by the poll about what is the most important factor, and Victoria points out that of course there is an interrelationship. If you haven't seen that, pop back to step 1.14 and let us know what you think. Now, I gather from some of the comments on step 1.15 that the bottleneck hypothesis has left some of you confused, and I'm not surprised at all. You see, I could hardly say it there. The bottleneck hypothesis is an attempt to explain a particular linguistic phenomenon, namely that functional morphology, according to the observations of Professor Slabakova, appears to be the hardest aspect to learn. Now, not all experts would support this view. It's a relatively recent theory, and as such, it's maybe not fully developed, and it's up for discussion, and that's why we've put it there. To whet your appetite, I guess, for more sort of academic discussions of theory, and to expose you to a new idea. If you're particularly interested, I have suggested this in response to the comments on step 1.15. If you're particularly interested in the theory and going into that in more depth, have a look online for what has been published about it and read beyond the few articles that we've linked to. If you try to find more recent works by authors who build on what Professor Slabakova has done, you might find different ways that it's explained that you find easier to understand. You might find people who criticise it or who contrast it with other theories, which again will help you situate your understanding of the bottleneck in the whole sort of field of language acquisition and what other people think about it. I think though, on a course like this, a short course with a huge diversity of participants, as I said, I meant to say that we can't go into any particular theory in too much depth. We need to move on now. And I think a lot of participants are looking to get some practical ideas for teaching and learning from a course like this. So we'll leave the further reading on that to you. But I think the bottleneck is still a useful analogy, even if you don't understand it in depth or don't understand it in the way that is intended. I think the idea that there's a sticking point, that there's often something in particular about language that takes a lot more practice, or that learners always appear to get wrong however many times you drum it into them. I think that can be a useful thing to recognise, that it's not just your learners or you, if you're a learner, being stupid or not being as good at learning a language as you'd like to be. It is actually a normal part of language learning, so perhaps it's useful to recognise that and to think of language acquisition as having a bottleneck in quite a general way. So what else have we got? I think that's pretty much all I've got time to say, in fact, for this week. Next week we'll be looking at different approaches to classroom teaching. So the focus next week is a bit more practical. Interestingly, though, I will just quickly mention that the longest conversation in week 1 so far was started by Frank on step 1.15, and that conversation remains very relevant in week 2. So have a look at that before you move on, or pop back to it when you've moved on. Frank points out that we acquire our first language generally through immersion in the language, through exposure, and without any explicit teaching. And he poses the question, why don't we do that when we're learning additional languages? Of course, there's no single answer or simple answer, and I think that will come up again in discussion in week 2 when we're talking about approaches to classroom teaching. So a good bridge there on the last step, almost the last step of week 1 to week 2. It should be an exciting week, and I'm looking forward to discussing the materials with you soon. Bye for now.